So if you browse a bit on the Netflix website, you can stumble upon a page called The World of the Witcher, as if they actively want you to know that they made Blood Origin. If you have been around this channel, you know just how much I hate the word universe when it comes to TV shows and movies. We have already discussed just how well attempts at universes go, because these days, it seems as though there is something wrong with focusing on one thing only. Nah, you have to have at least 2 spin-offs planned, at least 1 prequel in there too, because nothing can stand on its own these days, and everything needs a spin-off and every IP needs to be launched into a franchise. So as it stands, the Witcher universe has the main show. It has had 2 anime movies, it has had 1 prequel, and it also has another budding flop spin-off about a cast of characters no one cares about. Because Witcher over at Netflix is truly the definition of putting the cart before the horse. And I believe it wouldn't be an overstatement to say that this brand at Netflix has become a constant PR crisis. It now has gotten to a point that whenever anything new comes out about the show, it is immediately met with backlash. It does not matter what comes out, it will literally be received as awful, and it does not even matter anymore what Netflix does as a studio. The brand is now permanently poisoned, but it sure as hell did not start that way. Actually, it was quite the opposite story. But before we go further, hey there, make sure to hit that subscribe button. If you do, you will receive 7 years of immaculate luck. If you don't, Santa won't come to your house this year. Kidding about the Santa, of course. I would appreciate a sub. Back to the video. So the story begins in 2017 when Netflix tells everyone it will do the Witcher TV show. It is announced the same year that a person named Lauren Schmidt-Histrick would come to showrun this project. She apparently was an executive producer for Marvel's Daredevil and The Defenders as far as her credentials go, and you see, her credentials, or rather the lack thereof, can really go either way. It is not necessarily a strong portfolio that would seemingly warrant someone a showrunner's role, but so wasn't Craig Mazin's, and the dude created and wrote the entirety of Chernobyl. So you know, it can really go either way. Let's talk about something called promises, because a lot of promises were actually made. The showrunner and the Netflix Witcher brand is now not really that well liked in certain circles, but that wasn't always the case. The showrunner initially presented herself as someone who basically comes to this project with a solemn promise to follow the books. And yes, that is right, the franchise is based on books. Usually the Witcher name is associated with the games first, which made the Witcher brand as popular as it is now in the first place. But the games themselves were based off of books that were written by a Polish man named Andrzej Sapkowski. A lot of people, me included, found this out from the show. Here you have a whole Reddit thread nearly a decade ago of people being generally supportive, and the showrunner herself pledging to make the show faithful to the source. And I truly cannot emphasize enough just how welcoming the fandom was in general of these developments surrounding the show. There were even some jokes about how the fandom is deifying the person. She even had an AMA on Reddit that went so well. There were even videos of her talking with the author and them having a nice conversation about the universe. She had all the signs of legitimacy and approval. But even in the light of all the positivity, I think it would have been the most wise not to engage in so much conversation. Listen, it might be a very counterintuitive advice, since what she's basically doing is providing publicity for her project and there is nothing inherently wrong with that, but it does exist in a narrative that she's entering rather than creating. Witcher, for the longest time, has had a fandom that feel very strongly about the brand and the stories told in there, so there is a big danger in setting up expectation over tweets and AMAs, because if you have the talent, then it will be seen as confidence, and if you don't, then it will be seen as arrogance. It is a very simple principle that exists everywhere in life, and I feel like maybe she really should have just kept her head down and not make herself as big of a face in this project. Even now, these statements only seem kinda not good due to hindsight, but when season 1 came, the showrunner's statements were still perceived positively. It's not like the show needed much publicity under the Witcher banner. It already had a fan base, however skeptical they might have been before she began to interact with them. I would just suggest to let the show speak for itself, especially in the first season. It is always better to just yap less than to yap more in some cases. Not to create an echo chamber, but to not stoke unnecessary flames. So, it's 2019 and the first season comes. And the first season is notably adapting 2 first books in the series called The Last Wish and The Sword of Destiny. One thing to note is that they are not regular books, they are anthologies for short stories. That is how Witcher started, with shorter format stories that focus on different things and take place in different time periods. That is what the author is really good at. So the show goes about in adapting these stories in a bit of an alternative way, let's say it like that. So the first way in which it majorly deviates is making the show focus on 3 characters instead of 1 from the beginning. The short stories follow the titular Witcher, aka Geralt of Rivia. Only later novels feature the 2 other major characters in the franchise, Ciri and Yennefer of Vengerberg, more prominently. So the show decides to bring these characters forward earlier. I am personally not mad at that. The way they adapted them was a bit of a mishmash of 3 different storylines that spanned different amounts of time, which resulted in some things being completely completely invented, some things cut out, and quite a lot of new ones just trimmed off. And it would be disingenuous of me to say that I didn't initially enjoy the first season a lot. I did really like it back in 2019, because back then, while it was not the best thing, at least you could be looking forward to a potentially great show. There was a ton more optimism towards the show before the other seasons came around, and I myself did view whatever flaws it had more favorably. And flaws... it had. First, the whole 3 separate storyline structure resulted in a fairly disjointed narrative, which to me wasn't bad at all. I enjoyed that shit actually. It was cute how different people referenced some minor things throughout the show's history in different ways.
Queen Calanthe of Sintra, she just won her first battle at Hoshbaz. She's a child.
You won your first battle in Hoshbaz when you were my age.
The world and story felt grand. It also came together at the end in an interesting way, but I imagine that it could have led to a bit more confusion, and it generally isn't advisable to tell a story in that way if you want to reach the biggest audience and not to lose engagement. The adaptation itself is not really the best. There has been a ton of talk about how the show manages to miss a ton of points from the original source material, which I cannot myself attest to too much since I don't remember a lot of the short stories, but it was noticeable enough to become a big topic of discussion around the show. But then we also have what the show invented. That is the backstory of Yennefer primarily. I will say that while others probably were looking forward to Geralt the most, I was looking forward towards Yennefer. And on the first viewing I thought it was kinda cool, but hindsight is really 2020, and rewatches have not really improved my outlook on the way they handle her backstory. First of all, the show has a quirk around its magic. It is pretty loosey-goosey when it comes to it, which I kind of hate in my fantasy TV shows. It's not necessarily that it's wildly inconsistent or anything, it's just... feels weird. It is a lot of random bullshit go as far as the magic system goes. Like, one of the trials for young mages is just catching lightning in a bottle, which I mean, it might have happened in the books. I am not that deep into the book lore or anything, but that's pretty frigging random considering that the show was very big on this chaos magic requiring cost. How do mages catching lightning contribute to that? I don't really know. Or how the most useless young mages are then just turned into eels for shits and giggles and just swim in some underground Aretusa pool. Or this very distinct thing such as fire magic, which is not very defined, but I guess it's there. Does air, earth, water magic exist as well? There just doesn't necessarily feel like there is one cohesive idea behind the magic system. There are also monoliths, which I initially thought were pretty interesting as far as unexplained huge black rocks in media go, and this is a consistent flaw that you will see across the whole universe. Whenever there is an original idea to the show introduced, it never goes through any deeper thought process. The writers just come up with it, seemingly write the first draft, and do no further thought about it. If the original content feels shallow and unconvincing, that is because it didn't have any thought put into it, to iron out the wrinkles or to make it have more substance. It sometimes feels like the show writes a paragraph where an entire essay should be written, if that makes sense. The first season just also has weird-ass scenes which would become a staple in the show in a way. Like Yennefer once decides to go back to the magic school, goes in, sees young mages, and decides to give them a herbal trip for no particular reason. It's just there. The dialogue sometimes is also just, and I mean...
You motherfucking goat, you're a dick with balls.
So I feel like it is fairly safe to say that it had areas to improve at, and I feel like those areas are quite easily improvable. Not a lot was broken to beyond repair, but there were certainly cracks. And I think that the first season also just has a nice distinct vibe and art direction. One thing, music, amazing music, slaps. Sure, the Nilfgaardian armor was absolute shit, but I feel like everything else gave the world its own grand feel. I heard that people were mad at other costumes for them being weirdly modern, but I personally wasn't mad that I really liked it. But I also don't know what medieval Europe fits should look like, so my opinion comes from vibes. And I feel the reception pretty much reflects all of the sentiment pretty well. The reviews were at worst mixed, at best kind of average to good, and that I think is a pretty decent starting point to a potentially epic show. But if that was to happen, we wouldn't be here, would we? So buckle the hell up. So I feel like this is the point where the show reaches its height in its perception, its state, whatever. So what does the team behind it do? They begin to hype up the next season, which is rather natural. There are a few things in particular that are said. We are listening to criticism and we will not deviate from the books and we will be faithful. This does change down the line though, because later on the showrunner does admit that this season would be the furthest they should ever deviate from the books, aka the season 2. There are, however, entire threads within the fandom that do criticize the first season. There are already rumblings in the fringes of the fandom that the first season is disrespectful and there is even this weird petition to get her removed as a showrunner. None of these things necessarily stuck, but the universe does love some good foreshadowing. Nonetheless, yes, the showrunner seems to be more confident than ever, and they release an anime movie called The Witcher: Nightmare of the Wolf, and it isn't that bad. I thought it was okay little adventure, something nice to fill in the void between the seasons of the mothership show. It focused on Vesemir in his younger years, had a nice little plot. It was actually kinda cool. But then, the second season comes out in 2021, and 2 years of eager anticipation result in a complete flop. I find it hard to find an area in which the show retained its original quality, let alone improve on it. We will talk about all that jazz more, but first, I feel like we need to talk about something else. So when the world was more optimistic about the Witcher brand and Netflix way back when, there were certain delusions about long-haul plans for The Witcher. We now know that the 5th season will be its last, thank God, but that wasn't always the case. The plan originally was 7 seasons, which was a very bad idea, and it all ties back to the books. I feel like what tends to be forgotten in discussions around The Witcher is the source material itself. Yeah, sure, people tend to focus on what the series does or doesn't do right in regards to the books, but not a lot of attention is paid to the fact that the show also does a shit job at choosing how to distribute the material. It isn't uncommon for TV shows to go 1 book per season. Season 1 of Witcher went 2 books per that season because they were anthologies and that made sense, but then they chose to take 1 book for the 2nd season, which again, bad idea. The book that they based it on, The Blood of Elves, is not really a book that can be made into a whole season of the show, and now I encourage the book fans to brace themselves. The Blood of Elves is, in my view, a weak book. First, it barely has any plot and is more focused on world building and character development. I personally found it to be a humongous slog to get through and overall just not very satisfying on its own. In the grand scale of the saga, yes, I see its worth. Even the showrunner herself commented on the same, and it is one of the rare instances where our views are completely aligned. But at no moment while reading it did I think, I kinda wanna see this expanded into a season of television. I assume that this was done to space out the content and make the build up towards the Thanet coup more grand. I mean, I guess it would have felt weird to have it happen right at the end of the 2nd season, or maybe not. I get the value of properly building towards a huge event like that, but the source material really doesn't warrant 16 episodes for that. I personally mayhaps would have liked to see them fold 2 books into 1 again and just stick to the text more, because what this lack of material to draw from and to make a full season results in is the show having to invent shit. And let me just reiterate that the show never really excelled at inventing its own things. So the first thing that the show had to find was the plot. Since the book didn't really have that much of it, they decided to introduce this wee woo woo kooky witch named the Deathless Mother, the Voleth Mare. And I have said before on this channel in a now deleted review that this character felt like a glorified plot device. Season 1 was really big on destiny and stuff, which made sense in the context of the books being released way back when destiny wasn't as ran through as a concept in fantasy. But the 2nd season kinda takes this a bit further. They use the Deathless Mother to basically kickstart and guide the plot, which is kinda like Destiny. Having a puppeteer type character requires a ton of ingenuity to make right and engaging. And guess what? The Witcher does not in fact have that kind of ingenuity. I just kinda dislike it because it makes the plot happen to the characters and not necessarily the plot happen because of characters. Does that make sense? Like, it sure is convenient that this previously unmentioned random woman just begins showing up in dreams of 3 different prominent women from the 1st episode of the 2nd season, which just appeared for the sake of the plot out of nowhere. And then they all meet her and she just conveniently tells them what to do and what to go towards. And that is basically the plot of the season. It's awful storytelling. Then we also have the fact that Yennefer loses all her power at the end of the 1st season, and her looking to regain her powers the whole of the 2nd season. It is just so cheap as a trope of having a powerful magician losing their powers, and it's not like they executed well either. Aside from that, the 2nd season makes some piss poor attempts at following up on the whole monolith mystery that they have teased in the 1st season. Istrid was yapping about how every glyph has a meaning for something across the continent and can give clues for the time before the conjunction, which sounded kinda dope, I won't lie. But then in season 2, it's just revealed that they are just like portals for monsters to come through, and that's it? Okay. Which is, again, it's not necessarily bad, it's just a bit meh. Just in general, whenever it came to some sort of monsters in the 2nd season, it wasn't really that interesting. Season 1 had at least some intrigue and plot, like the whole thing with the Striga. Here they just kinda spawn and the Witchers fight them and that is all. I guess that is their job, but it makes for some uninteresting television. Then we also get the introduction of more elves this season. I gotta admit, I do not give a flying about their plot because, oh my god, they were boring. I'm sorry, but nothing in their writing really drew me in to care for them. Yeah, on the surface level and on paper, their struggles were very real, but I would rather fast forward through their scenes than sit down around and see these uninteresting characters do shit. Fringilla was also boring as shit. I have no idea why we follow her as a character. There's nothing engaging about her, okay? There's nothing engaging. Basically, everything was varying degrees of boring and didn't really draw me in, honestly. Even stylistically, the show became cheap. A lot of people were like, oh my god, the show improved, it looks so much better. But honestly, no, it did not. Sure, it became more saturated, but the show is so oversaturated and bright that the environment does feel like a manufactured set. I really missed season 1 cinematography and direction because at least it served vibes. Then we also have the fact that where the hell is the season 1's music? Season 1 music was amazing, and in season 2, it became generic as shit. Then we also just have the fact that the show cannot write something actually serious to save its life. One of the better aspects of season 1 for me was the whole deal with the Brotherhood. Their scenes were dope and they actually felt mysterious and cool. In season 2, they just feel a bit like a joke. Like they are just trying so hard to be mysterious and cool, but it's just not giving that. The most idiotic thing with them was way in the beginning of the season, right after the Sodden Hill battle. Yen manages to get back to Aretusa and they just begin accusing her of being a Nilfgaardian spy. Yen literally almost killed herself for their cause and comes back after a bit all roughed up, and their first assumption is that she's a spy. Okay. I am willing to admit that there might have been more merit to the storyline of suspicion towards Yennefer than I am giving it credit for. The show still presents it in a very dumb way, which we will get to right now. Sure, I get that Stregobor is spreading misinformation just to fuck with them, but everyone just collectively buys the narrative, and then Tisea proceeds to suggest to her that she has to kill Cahir to prove her loyalty. Okay, T, but I feel like if Yennefer was truly a spy, neither Nilfgaard nor Yen would particularly care to kill Cahir just to not blow cover. Like, having one of your own in the Brotherhood would be infinitely more valuable for Nilfgaard rather than having Cahir alive. But of course, because we are watching The Witcher, the Deathless Mother whispers some fancy gibberish into Yen's ear, and she proceeds to break Cahir free, and they just manage to ride away on the horse while nobody does anything about it. This is before we get to Vesemir almost turning Ciri into a Witcher, and before we get to sex workers making their way to Kaer Morhen, and before we get to the dear friend moment from the books being butchered. Also, the ending is hella dumb. Just in general, the world of the second season feels so much more cheaper. It doesn't feel as expansive and varied as the first season because everything just became so generic looking. This whole season is just a tangent in the grander saga that gets characters to the most random and necessary points in their arcs and kinda ruins whatever should come after. But as if there weren't enough tangents in this Witcher universe, we get a prequel that no one ever asked for. The Witcher Blood Origin came out between seasons 2 and 3 of the main show and was a complete disaster. Feels like it has no point except to display the mainline show's worst impulses but dialed up to infinity. It is meant to detail what happened during this big event way deep in the past called the Conjunction of the Spheres. Not a lot is said about it in the Holy Scripture, aka the books, so you know that they had to make shit up. And as is the rule with this universe, the made up stuff is hot garbage, and this show consists 100% of it. It currently sits at the prestigious 5 out of 10 stars on IMDb, and 5 stars is really frigging generous if you ask me. I am going to die on the hill that this TV show is not a TV show. It is a list of plot points happening. Here we have a bunch of characters who are going on this supposedly epic journey, and things just happen to them. I have seen some explanations for this emerging, some saying that this is kind of like a high tale or an epic myth being told or whatever the hell the delusion was, and I cannot stand that and I will not take that lying down. If you have watched any of my videos, I think I have been pretty clear about my opinion about shows doing something dumb, but then explaining it with some reasoning that they have, and that is supposed to transform the bad idea into a good one. I think it is pretty obvious that the show goes for the epic tale vibe, but if you are producing a narrative within the Witcher universe for a pretty frigging adult audience, I think it is pretty easy to see how that can go south. I'm not sure anyone wanted to tune in to watch a bunch of elves just do random shit in an underdeveloped world with zero proper world building, and I think that a lot of potential storytelling just flies over the heads of whoever wrote the show. There is a lot of talk around the show about the power of music and preserving history through music. The show basically was a tale that Jaskier was supposed to use on elves in season 3 to rally them. If they were just a tiny bit smarter, they could have made this into a story of what actually went down rather than we have a boring voiceover and we are just showing things happening without any further point. The one slightly interesting thing that is alluded to is elves oppressing the dwarves, which could have been an interesting thing to contemplate considering in the mainline show they were in a similar position of being oppressed, but the show isn't smart, so we don't get any of that. Instead, we get the continuation of the highly anticipated fanfiction surrounding the monoliths and how the first Witcher was made. Prequels usually already sound bad on their own because usually they are very unnecessary and carelessly made, and Blood Origin isn't beating those allegations anytime soon. I think what really crossed a deep line for me personally is that there is just not much that distinguishes this show from the main Witcher show, yet they are set like 1,000 years apart chronologically. The elves don't behave any different than the humans. Their societies are for some reason just the same. There is nothing to distinguish them in any manner. It feels like no care went into any aspect of the show, so honestly, why should we care? Again, it is the very same issue ever since season 1. The show has an original idea that is not in the books, and it doesn't matter that it has no substance or if it is a boring trope, it just runs into it with open arms. The show in particular is an insane offender to this, because even the world building that we get of the world, it sounds like something a middle schooler could have made. All of that just to say, it's fucking bad. If you ever plan to watch it at your own discretion, because you have been warned. And you can imagine that neither the fans of The Witcher nor the general audiences were very pleased with the slop that was season 2 or the prequel. And I feel like that is because the show is affected by a very toxic pattern that can be boiled down to reimagining Witcher for no reason. You can see throughout interviews that the showrunner and people working on the show are passionate about what they do. I feel like this is the one thing you can not fault them for. They are passionate. Yes, their skills are just not there, but there is passion. But it is a passion for their version of The Witcher, which is the problem here. What I noticed is that Lauren kept emphasizing the need to find different characters and perspectives and stuff like that to tell these stories. And I think that she kinda just chose a completely wrong approach in doing that. Let's assume for a second that she was just passionate about the world and not about the money bag attached to the project. Let's assume there was some deeper idea in there she wanted to tell and not just this primal urge to create brainless slop. I feel like her approach kind of resembles Wicked. Before you click off, let me explain. It is a fairly left turn in the context of The Witcher, but Wicked is now known as its own thing, but it started because the author of Wicked books saw The Wizard of Oz and imagined a different story for the main villain, the Wicked Witch of the West. What I really like about it is that Wicked adheres pretty well to the original lore. There are some deviations, but it manages to see a different story set in the same world as The Wizard of Oz. And I do feel like the projects are sufficiently distinct to warrant a difference in tone. So when Lauren does her little thing where she tries to highlight female characters and whatnot, it does kind of feel like maybe she sees different stories in the main story, and that is all kind of cool. If you're a fanfiction writer, imagine if someone wanted to adapt Wicked, but adapted it by using the name Wizard of Oz, kept assuring people it would stay as close to the original Wizard of Oz as much as possible, but then changed everything and made it what Wicked is, but without any elegance and way worse. Of course, it wouldn't be as bad because at least Wicked has better writing for what it is, but the approach just creates inherent whiplash. Right now, what it reads as is someone coming in, taking a beloved IP, and injecting their own stuff with it. I bring up Wicked because Wicked itself isn't exactly an adaptation of Wizard of Oz. It is an entirely different thing, just like whatever Netflix's Witcher is. And it would not be as bad because the different mediums can result in different things all the time. But Lauren herself has gone to extreme lengths to emphasize just how much she likes and respects the books, and how she would aim to follow them, which just now reads as lip service, because the writers are very capable of saying exactly the right things to fans to make them happy without any intention on following through with them. And it is a baffling approach, because some things that they say just seem plain untrue. Like, why claim you will faithfully adapt the books and then just not do it? It is a very disingenuous approach and a very transparent move to show that you do not really care. And this is even without just being unnecessarily hateful. It is just a plain fact. Objectively speaking, these actions just suggest this. And then the absolute cherry on top happens. As if this wasn't disastrous enough, Henry Cavill, the main face of the show, decides to leave. Here is the announcement post on his Instagram if you want more salt on that wound. Now, the reasons why this happened have never been concretely stated, and you should expect that to remain this way at least for a while, if ever, since you can bet that there are at least some NDAs in place. But the main assumptions formed from the limited knowledge that the public did have was basically this. Henry Cavill wanted more book accuracy, the writing team kinda said hell nah, and that is why Henry left. It is a pretty simple narrative that the internet was ready to rally behind, considering that up until this point the writing team didn't do itself too many favors, so them being the ultimate villains in this situation is just the ultimate pinnacle of this train wreck that the show has been. I personally, however, and this is gonna be an extremely hot take, would like to imagine that the situation wasn't exactly as binary. I do think that the general narrative is just a bit too overblown, considering that a lot of it leaves out some nuances that the public can also access. Yes, creating TV shows is a collaboration, but there still is a hierarchy in place. Cavill was hired to do a job for this project. He wasn't in charge of it. Maybe he should have been, maybe not. But you have to consider that we do not know how he delivered his grievances and how many of them were listened to or not. But in any workplace, if you have differences in vision between you and overhead, it can naturally create friction. It occurs so much in life, it is only that Witcher happened to be popular as hell that this became such a big deal. But I also think that no one should live under any illusion that Cavill's interpretation of the project would have been perfect. It never should be the expectation in the first place, since visions and stuff like that are just subjective, and you're really just setting yourself up for a disappointment if you think someone has the vision. There is this Reddit post by spare_tangerine_2549 that compiles some of the changes that have been documented to have been made by Henry, and they are not necessarily as book accurate as you would expect if you subscribe to him being the champion for the books. I think that parasocial is a word that best describes the situation. At the end of the day, I can definitely see a situation where creative differences played a huge part, but I doubt it was only that. All of the people involved are here to work on the show and get paid, not just because they just adore the fandom so much. It is a harsh thing to say, but it is also the truth. When you see what is being presented, think about what also isn't. That is really a thought that keeps following me revisiting this entire situation, because there's probably a lot of things that we just don't know. Cavill also has his own reputation and career to think of, and the thought of whether the Witcher fandom is satisfied doesn't occupy his mind as much as one might think. All of that is to say that it is definitely not a 50-50 split in blame of the downfall of the show. It is more like 99.5% versus 0.5%, with the majority of it still laying at the feet of the writing team. I am just encouraging you to maybe question things a bit more rather than to just accept it as pure fact, because pure facts we do not have. And I do believe that Henry made the best decision in this situation. He just quit when his vision didn't align with the overall project, and that is a wise thing to do. But the optics of it are what really matters here, since we do live in a post-truth world, and those have never looked so dim and dire for the show. Because it does send a certain type of message when the person who seemed enthusiastic about being part of this project going so far as to say that he would stay around for 7 seasons is driven away from the show. It is something that the show will never recover from. And this shitstorm leads us into Season 3. Season 3 is honestly especially triggering, considering it is supposed to be a big payoff moment for a lot of things happening throughout the show. Like the Thanet coup is a big event in the books, and this season is the closest that the show gets to adapting the books, but the show, to save its life, cannot muster any amount of seriousness to do it justice. First, it has to fast-track Geralt and Ciri into forgiving Yen for her stupid arc in the last season, and then it has to begin doing the Conclave, which goes as well as you would expect from the show. I remember the days when people tried hailing The Witcher as Netflix's Game of Thrones, but that comparison is really ridiculous considering that The Witcher seems like it is written for kids. One of the biggest gripes for me this season is that the tone is just way off with the things that are happening. This season just becomes really sentimental, and I don't think that the show benefits from it. And I'm not saying that the show shouldn't try to elicit emotion, but I feel like there is a tremendous difference between eliciting emotion and whatever The Witcher does. It just becomes so sappy, characters are suddenly inspirational to one another, friendship wins, love wins, which isn't as biting as it should have been, given that this is supposed to be the follow-up to this big political plotting across the continent. Then we also have a scene where the sorceresses just DIY invitations for the Conclave themselves in a cutesy patootsy scene, as if they wouldn't have had some novices to do the dirty work for them. Nah, they just have to pick up the scissors and glue themselves, and honestly, I hate that. Like, genuinely, I hate that. I would have loved to see a more serious and grounded rendition of mages. I always felt that Aretuza was the most intriguing thing about this world, but it all got reduced to mages just showing up without any prior setup, and suddenly Yennefer has relationships with them. Of all things to flesh out, they could have went with that, since the books I believe also don't really flesh it out. Then we also have people like Fringilla just getting a meeting on a whim with the Emperor of Nilfgaard. Or we just get this shit-ass fight scene in Aretuza. I just don't know how to describe it, but there is absolutely no grandiosity or formality in anything that The Witcher presents. Even the dialogue line to line sounds so amateur and childish. It is kind of the same issue that I had with House of the Dragon Season 2. For a story that presents itself as this this epic saga of scheming and machinations and intrigue, it sure as hell lacks any actual substance or bite. It feels like people keep talking about how there are politics happening, but I for sure am not feeling much of politics happening. Like, where are the politics? Like, are the politics in the room with us right now? I just wish to see everyone be more cutthroat, I suppose. The one character that I liked the depiction of was Wolgefortz. I liked seeing him mess Geralt up real bad, because at least then things felt serious and like the show had stakes. And you know what? I am exhausted. It is an absolute miracle how a TV show can go this bad inside and outside. There are probably a dozen mini controversies that I didn't even touch on. And also, can we just address this trend of manufacturing these universes once again? I truly do not get what is wrong with having just one thing to stand on its own. What is so wrong with focusing on one single show and making sure that that is good first? Take Blood Origin, for instance, a show that they used as a vehicle for their own shit idea surrounding the monoliths. It is just this rabid desire to expand stuff into oblivion and make it profitable that just gets to me. Once again, we arrive to the same conclusion that capitalism bad. Also, it just kind of shows that there is no quality control within Netflix. God knows that the show and universe would have died after the second season, yet here we are, with them threatening to release season 4 any day now. Is the company just filled with people constantly telling the Witcher team yes? Is the writing team filled with people just constantly telling each other yes? It sure as hell seems that way. Will I be around for season 4? Yeah, I will. I am a content creator for f***'s sake, but I am also just, you know, warming my hands to the dumpster fire. And speaking of dragging things out unnecessarily, goodbye.